Well, the title, as you heard, has to do with the peace process in the Middle East. Peace process is in quotes, as befits a technical term. I'll start by, in fact, spend most of my time talking about the latest stage in the so-called peace process, what's called Oslo II, the agreement that was signed on September 28th at the White House. And I want to talk about two aspects of it. One, just what the bare facts are, so at least we know what we're talking about. And two, the way it's been portrayed. This part isn't really about my ideas about the story. I'll try to keep as close to simple fact as I can without, you can censor if I go beyond. After that, I'll make a couple of remarks about the background. And again, I want to talk about those two aspects, what the bare facts are and the way it's portrayed, which is also the comparison between the two is of some significance, I think. And then a few remarks, as time allows, on some prospects and more general significance of all of this. Well, since this is a classroom, I might as well use it. The bare facts are these. The Oslo II does not deal with the Gaza Strip. That remains as in Oslo I, which was Israel took about 30% of it, and I'll talk about the status of it later, and that remains the same. So this has to do with the West Bank. The areas conquered in 1967. The West Bank areas conquered in 1967. These are divided into four zones. Zone A is the zone of Palestinian administration. There's to be a Palestinian council elected which will run Zone A. Zone B is what's called the zone of autonomy. Autonomy means local control, local administration by Palestinian authorities under overall Israeli security control. Zone C is the part that's totally controlled by Israel. And then there's a fourth zone, which these are official names. This is an unofficial name, that's mine. Zone D, which is Greater Jerusalem. That's an indefinite and expanding area around East Jerusalem to the north and the east. That's also part of the West Bank officially, but that's Zone D, and nothing is said about Zone D in the agreements, just Zones A, B, and C. Well, let's begin with Zone D. My name again, the the Jerusalem and the area around it. If you look at the map, say the big. I should say incidentally, I'll talk about the size and character of these zones. This is all, in a sense, unofficial. That is, the official documents aren't really available in great detail. But there are plenty of maps and plenty of commentary and speeches by high Israeli officials, and in fact I'm relying mostly on the Israeli press now, although it's appeared in the New York Times and other places here too. If you look at the New York Times map, or the Israeli maps, or in fact any of the others, you'll notice that Zone D is just assigned to Israel, period. It's not even part of the West Bank anymore. It's assigned the West, the same color as Israel on the New York Times map, if you look. The reason is that Israel simply announced that while back that Greater Jerusalem, I'll talk about its scope in a moment, will remain the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, and there's no comment on that. You may recall a while back Arafat made some comments about how the Palestinians were going to continue their struggle for Jerusalem as in accord with the official wording of the Oslo agreements. That caused a huge uproar in the West about how the old terrorist hadn't abandoned his ways and so on. But that was, it was Arafat's jihad. When Prime Minister Rabin announced a while back that Israel's jihad was over, they had already completed it, and that this would remain the eternal and undivided capital with whatever borders they decide on. That aroused no comment at all, no comments about the old terrorist and so on and so forth. And as I say, the maps simply assign it to Israel, period, without comment. And that makes sense. This is in accord with U.S. policy, so therefore it's correct by definition and requires no comment. It's not a U.S. official policy, I should say. Officially, the U.S. opposes this, but it's U.S. actual policy. So that's just Zone D. Well, let's look at the other three zones, the ones that are still under discussion. Zone C, Israel, that's roughly 70% of the West Bank. 72%, according to Prime Minister Rabin, around that neighborhood, around 70%. That's total Israeli control. No Palestinian authority whatsoever. The autonomy zone, the zone of Palestinian local autonomy under Israeli control, that's on the order of, you'll notice these aren't going to add up exactly to 100 because they're approximate. That's on the order of 30%, 29 to 31%, something in that area. And that's divided, if you look at the Israeli maps and you bother to count, that's divided into roughly 100 separate scattered sectors. So there's about 100 sectors here, roughly. These are rough numbers, which are scattered areas around within the 70% that Israel controls, and those little scattered areas are the autonomy. That's where there's local Palestinian control. And the area that's under Palestinian authority is something on the order of 2%, plus or minus. That's the municipal areas, basically downtown areas of half a dozen towns. In the Zone C, this one has 140,000, according to the Israeli sources, 140,000 Jewish settlers, a couple hundred Arabs. Zone B has, zones B and A together have 1.1 million Arabs. That's the, those are the sort of bare facts. Of the towns, one was contested. This area has no Jewish settlers. One town, Hebron, has Jewish settlers, so that was contested. There are about 450 Jewish settlers and around 100,000 Arabs, so there Israel keeps substantial control. That's Hebron, the one town with people in it. Well, of the areas conquered in 1967 to the west, there are about 300,000 Jewish settlers now, according to Israeli sources, about half in formerly Arab East Jerusalem, which now has a Jewish majority, which has been annexed to Israel and has indeed been growing and is continuing to grow pretty rapidly since Oslo I. Well, those are the bare facts. Now let's take a look at some of the background provisions which go along with this. Since Israel made compromises, it insists on compromises from the other side, and the compromises from the other side are some provisions. First of all, Oslo II reaffirms the provisions of earlier agreements, like the Cairo Accords of May 1994, which stipulate, I'm quoting it now, that any legislation by Palestinians in their 1 or 2% or whatever it will be, any Palestinian legislation, I'm quoting, cannot deal with a security issue that falls under Israel's responsibility and cannot seriously threaten other significant Israeli interests protected by this agreement. The Israeli administration, which covers the whole 100%, everything, retains exclusive authority in legislation, adjudication, policy execution, and responsibility for the exercise of these powers in conformity with international law. International law is another rather flexible concept, which means whatever the United States decides. That's by definition international law. I'm sure they teach you that in the political science courses here. So that means the whole intricate system, which is quite complex, of military ordinances remains intact, apart from, I'm quoting, such legislative, regulatory, and other powers as Israel may expressly grant to the Palestinians, while Israeli judges retain veto power over any Palestinian legislation, that might, quoting again, that might jeopardize major Israeli interests which have overriding power. Those are all quotes from the May 1994 Cairo Agreement, which remains. Now, Oslo II adds more to that. It adds to it that any future Palestinian authority, that's referring to the Palestinian Council that's to be elected, there's much fanfare now about elections in the zone of Palestinian administration, and there is to be a Palestinian Council, and any such council must recognize, quoting, the legal rights of Israelis related to government and absentee land located in areas under the territorial jurisdiction of the Council. So that's referring to these areas, the scattered 100 scattered sections here and the 1 or 2% there. In that area, they've got to recognize, and of course the rest we don't talk about, they have to recognize the legal rights of Israelis related to government and absentee land, which means in effect that any Palestinian authority is going to have to accept the legality, has accepted, the legality of existing Jewish settlements in the occupied territories, already existing ones, and any future ones that Israel may choose to construct, including the ones now being initiated. And it also recognizes Israeli sovereignty over whatever parts of the West Bank Israel will decide ultimately to control. It'll call them state lands or absentee lands, these are unilateral decisions, so you decide them any way you like. Now, how much is that? Well, we don't really know in detail, but there is the main kind of careful scholarly sources, the report on Israeli settlements of the Foundation of Middle East Peace in Washington, very reputable journalists, and they've assessed it as being probably about 90% of Area B that falls under this. That's where these conditions apply. That's only an estimate because the ruling authorities don't release specific data since they want to keep it flexible. Well, those provisions are kind of important, incidentally so important that they're not reported here at all, as far as I know. At least I can't find them. There have been a whole series of UN resolutions on the occupied territories for years, starting immediately after the occupation in November 1967, UN 242, the fundamental document crafted by the United States, incidentally. All such resolutions are rescinded. That's what this legislation means. All pronouncements of governments are rescinded, including the U.S. government. There have been a series of such Security Council and other resolutions, unanimous statements by governments, including the United States, which rejected flatly the annexation of Jerusalem, declared the settlements illegal, called upon Israel to observe the Geneva Conventions, rejected the right of acquisition of territory by force, called on Israel to withdraw, and so on, all rescinded by the agreements of Oslo II. Crucially, UN 242, which those of you who follow this know is the sort of basic diplomatic framework for discussion, UN 242 is completely dead and buried, along with everything else in the whole diplomatic history, the whole diplomatic process, which has been going on since then, and which since 1971 the United States has flatly opposed and totally opposed and utterly prevented from proceeding. That's what's called the peace process. 25 years of refusal to allow any diplomatic process to proceed. I'll come back to that. But anyway, it's all over because it's all rescinded by the specific provisos of Oslo II. One can see the importance of not reporting it. In brief, what it comes down to is that the United States does what it wants, and its client where they want and how they want. In fact, total capitulation to the most extreme U.S. demands from 1971, which have been held in virtual isolation. And that's a matter of much significance. If you want a sort of an analogy to get a sense of what happened, it's kind of as if the state of New York, let's say, decided to withdraw its police forces from the slums in South Bronx and Buffalo and let them sort of run their own affairs, while keeping all of the urban areas where it's worthwhile living, the commercial and financial centers, the industrial areas, the suburban regions, the entire resources, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, allowing the turning the areas put aside, let's say South Bronx, over to mercenary forces run by the New York police, or state police, but from the outside. And so that's the standard pattern of colonial control. It's the pattern of the U.S., say the British in India. About 90% of India was controlled by Indian soldiers under the British Empire. The whites of South Africa and Rhodesia used mostly black forces. In fact, they're the ones who carried out the worst atrocities. The United States and Central America, we don't call that colonies, but that's just cosmetic. U.S. colonies in Central America are run by local terrorist forces called the Army or something like that. And that's, in fact, the standard style of colonial control. It's stupid for any colonial power to try to run, the local people with its own forces. Much better to get local mercenaries, usually brought from some other region or something like that. And Israel's finally recognizing that the only thing that makes any sense is to revert to the classic colonial pattern, the South African, Indian, British and India type pattern, in the areas that it's handing over to some degree of Palestinian authority. Again, this 2% roughly, and these roughly 100 scattered sectors in there. Another standard of comparison which gives you a sense of what's just happened in Oslo II is to compare, to use as a standard of comparison, the position taken by the United States and Israel a couple of years earlier. That is, let's take the period of the peak moment of rejection, flat rejection of any dealing with the Palestinians and any Palestinian rights was in 1988. At that time, the U.S. and Israel insisted that, of course they were opposed to any Palestinian state as they are now, but they insisted that Israel keep 40% of the occupied territories, 40% of Gaza and the West Bank. That was explained by then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin of the Labor government. Said Israel's going to keep permanently about 40% of the territories. They want the rest. It's a waste of time. In 1995, we've just seen what the press calls a historic compromise, painful peace, great sacrifice. Namely, they take twice as much, along with resolutions, with agreements, side provisos, which rescind the whole record, with all resolutions bearing on illegality, Geneva Conventions, and everything else. That's the historic compromise. Well, there has indeed been another change, and that has to be mentioned. Israel has recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, of course not in any official declaration, but in a side letter that was submitted alongside of Oslo I. And that change has called forth a huge amount of commentary here. Great acclaim for, especially for Yitzhak Rabin and his ability, as they put it, to overcome his revulsion for his old enemy. I mean, it was hard, but he finally agreed. Those who herald this fantastic transformation prefer not to pay attention to what's being said by the objects of their admiration. For example, Shimon Peres, who's now Prime Minister and the person who was doing most of the dealing with the Palestinians and is considered the dove, the sort of extreme dove in the cabinet. He said right after Oslo I that yes, we are recognizing the PLO, but there has been, he said on Israeli television, but there has been a change in them, not us. We are not negotiating with the PLO, but only with a shadow of its former self, namely a shadow that is willing to abandon all of its demands. And those demands had been, certainly since about the mid-70s, explicitly in 1988, the demands had been for negotiations leading to mutual recognition in a two-state settlement along the lines of the international consensus held by essentially everyone outside the United States. They've abandoned that, so now we're willing to negotiate with them. Incidentally, it was that position that branded the PLO a terrorist organization, unfit to enter negotiations, according to U.S. doctrine in the and commentary virtually unanimous. Well, there have been another change since Oslo. Oslo 1 was September 93, just to get the date straight. That was the first of the two consummation of the first stage of the peace process. There's been another change since then, namely the ratio of killings of Palestinians and Israelis has changed. It used to be virtually all, mostly Palestinians killed. Since Oslo 1, that's from September 93 up till mid-95, I don't have subsequent figures. From September 93 up till mid-95, there were 255 Palestinians killed and 137 Israelis killed. So that is a substantial change. The term for that is an upsurge in Palestinian terror, which is not false, but plainly not quite the whole story. So that's changed. Meanwhile, from October 94 to January 95, it's the only time figures are available, 2,400 Palestinians were arrested for alleged Islamic tendencies. Meanwhile, Israeli terrorist actions in South Lebanon, in fact all of Lebanon, as much as they want, go on freely, and they're perfectly well known. When Shimon Peres took over as foreign minister right after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, there was a front page headline that said, Peres sets tone of post-Rabin era. And if you bothered reading the article, you noticed that in it, it mentioned that Israeli planes were bombing south of Beirut, well north of what they call their security zone. The security zone is a zone that Israel holds in South Lebanon, from which it was ordered to withdraw immediately and unconditionally by a Security Council, unanimous Security Council resolution in March 1978. But since the U.S. didn't mean it, and the U.S. runs these things, they're still holding their security zone, and with the aid of a terrorist mercenary army, but they also accept the right to bomb anywhere else. And that was announced once again, the date of on the day that Shimon Peres took over in late November. The adjacent column that day was about what the column called, what the U.S. government called a desperate act, a horrible act, a world at work of cowards, namely the bombing of a U.S. military training center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which also is not false, but again, not quite the whole story. In the Israeli terrorism in Lebanon, in the first half of 1995, killed about 100 people, mostly civilians. For example, 2 children killed in July, north of the security zone by anti-personnel weapons. More since, and I'm sure so you don't have to know anything about them. But anyhow, that keeps happening, and it's still happening. 2 days ago, Israeli tanks wounded, apparently seriously wounded, 3 Norwegian UN soldiers in the security zone with anti-personnel weapons. That did get a couple of lines, but we don't know anything more about it. These are peacekeeping forces. These are UN peacekeeping forces, but they're from Norway. They're not U.S. soldiers. U.S. soldiers don't go to take part in peacekeeping operations, which is a wise thing, because the shot at and wounded, or others who face threats. That's only other countries. In our case, the White House announced we're going to have robust rules of engagement. National Security Council, not like these wishy-washy Europeans. It's going to be like the National Security Advisor announced that if anyone fools around with our forces, we're going to help. The status of this situation is illustrated rather well by a High Court decision last May, Supreme Court decision last May, not reported here. There's an Israeli human rights group, Kavla Oved, which is a group that works for workers' rights. It's an Israeli group with professors from Hebrew University and that sort of thing. And they had appealed to the High Court for restitution to Arab workers of about $1 billion that had been taken off their salaries for social benefits, like pensions and that kind of thing, but had never been given to them. It had gone into the state treasury, and this is during the years of the occupation, and the appeal was for restitution of it. Well, the appeal was turned down by Justice Bazak of the High Court, because he said that the robbery of the $1 billion was retroactively legalized by the legislation, the Knesset legislation that authorized the Oslo I agreement. Furthermore, he accepted the legitimacy of the government's argument, which, as he said, was the following. The government had argued that the goal was never to keep Arab wages up. The goal was to keep Arab wages up only on paper, while keeping them low in practice. The point of keeping them high on paper, meaning they didn't get them, but somebody paid the wages into the treasury, was to prevent Jewish workers from having low-wage competition. You get the logic? You know, if you... Okay, so I don't have to explain. And then he went on to say that this is just the same as instituting protective tariffs, so of course it's perfectly legitimate, sort of thing a government does to protect its own workers. So therefore, it was legitimate in the first place, and anyway, it's retroactively legalized by Oslo I. Well, Israel's ban on development was well known. That Israel had... They're very good reporters in Israel. Have been covering the West Bank very well for years. One of them is Danny Rubenstein, no particular dove, incidentally, extremely good reporter. He said he wrote a recent article after the Jordan peace treaty. There was a, people went up and back, and they could sort of see what things were like in Jordan. And he wrote a long article after having covered the West Bank for years, in which he said that, we all knew that every effort had been made to impoverish the people of the West Bank. But he said he was still surprised to see what it amounted to when he went to Jordan, and he wrote quite an eloquent article. I actually have it here. I can quote some if you like. But the basic gist of it is that he said, look, this is a reasonable comparison, the West Bank and Jordan. There's about the same number of Palestinians. Pre-1967, the West Bank was somewhat more developed and advanced. Jordan is, of course, a poor third world country. Israel is a rich first world country which gets huge amounts of aid, way beyond any country in history. And therefore, the comparison, he said, is pretty striking. In Jordan, poor third world Jordan, the situation for the population has improved enormously since '67. In the West Bank, it's either stayed the same or gotten worse. In Jordan, there's roads and electricity and health services and schools and, factories and so on and so forth. In the West Bank, nothing, just destruction. In Jordan, you said arid. Jordan seemed much more arid than Israel. There are big water projects and there's flourishing agriculture all around the East Bank. In the West Bank, nothing. There is for Jewish settlers, but not for the Palestinians. In fact, 5/6 of the water in the West Bank is used either by Israel itself or by Jewish a couple of 100,000 Jewish settlers there. With regard to the resources, another part of Oslo II is that Israel continues to keep control of them. That's not changing. There was an agreement about West Bank water. Israel's water is not under discussion. There was an agreement about West Bank water between Israel and Jordan. It was interesting. It had no mention of the Palestinians. They were not even considered a party to that agreement, and that's traditional. Since the two states were founded in 1948 and even before in the pre-state period, Israel and Jordan have been united in their opposition to Palestinian nationalism. In fact, they colluded during the 1948 war and repeatedly. In the 1948 war, the designated Palestinian state was partitioned almost in half, in fact, between Israel and Jordan, more or less by pre-arrangement. Like there was any document in which they signed it, but that was the agreement, and it was partitioned. The part that was taken over by Israel is not even discussed. That's just part of Israel. The part that was taken over by Jordan, that's what we call the West Bank, and is now mostly being taken over to finish it. Israel, as I said, takes about 5/6 of West Bank water, and apparently will continue to, and also most of the water of Gaza, which really is extremely per capita, that is, arid. That's why reporters point out, and travelers and human rights workers and so on, that when you travel around these areas, like say Gush Katif and Gaza or the West Bank, you find swimming pools, fish ponds for which you now get extra subsidies, artificial lakes and tourist hotels, green lawns, water-intensive agriculture, and so on. Meanwhile, at the Arab villages, you may not have water at all, like no drinking water, perhaps. Certainly nothing like that. In the southern part of Gaza, for 20 days last summer, the Israeli water company, Makarut, that supplies water, just turned it off because people didn't have enough money to pay their bills. You go over to the West Bank, you find towns like Ubaidiya, which is without water for 18 months, 8,000 people. The nearby Jewish settlements, as I say, have green lawns and swimming pools and so on. In Hebron last summer, it was a pretty hot summer, the thousands of people were without drinking water for a long time, and those arrangements are presumably to continue. Israel claims the right of historic use of West Bank water, which they claim gives it the right to continue to use it under international law. That's the historic use since 1967. But the real right is just the rule of force, what rules international affairs generally, and that means approval of the superpower that pays the bill and makes the rules. That's international law, so they're right about that. Another aspect of the agreements not mentioned but implicitly taken care of is the Palestinian refugees. They're finished. There is nothing there about the Palestinian refugees. The millions of refugees who are elsewhere are gone. December 10th, what was that, 2 days ago? That was Human Rights Day, celebrated as always by exalted editorials about the sanctity of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and those terrible relativists out there who don't understand, like us, that you have to honor it. Incidentally, on the side, the U.S. is in the lead in violating the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights. About half of it the U.S. doesn't even recognize as applying, namely all the provisions on social and economic rights. But let's just keep to the part that the U.S. considers valid under its relativist principles, the first half, the civil and economic and political rights. In that part, the best known article of the UN Declaration on Human Rights is Article 13, and the reason that's very well known, especially in places like Boston, is that on Human Rights Day every year there was big demonstration, led by Harvard professors, calling on Russia to observe Article 13 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone has the right to leave their country, which it does. And then there's another phrase which was never mentioned. Everyone has the right to leave their country or to return to their own country. That part somehow people forgot about. And the reason was that the advocates of the passionate advocates of the Article 13, who were calling on Russia to let the Jews leave, were the most extreme opponents of Article 13. So therefore it was necessary for them and the loyal press and everyone else to refrain from saying that there was another phrase there and to return to their own country. And the reason for refraining from that was well known. That phrase was put in specific reference to Palestinian refugees who had just been driven out. And that was made very clear the next day, December 11th, 1948, in UN Resolution 194, which declared that the Palestinian refugees have, under Article 13, have the absolute unconditional right to return to their homes. And therefore we had to keep quiet about that half of Article 13. Well, the hypocrisy is finished, at least, thankfully. The first half is now irrelevant, and the second half has been rescinded. They don't have a right anymore by unilateral U.S. decision, so that part of Article 13 is gone. Clinton has been the most extreme in this regard. Clinton has cut U.S. aid to UNRWA, which was the major, the refugee relief organization that was set up to take care of these refugees until they received their guaranteed right under the UN Declaration of Human Rights to return to their homes. He cut the U.S. contribution. They were the biggest employer in Gaza. In fact, the center has been shifted from Lebanon to Gaza to make it clear that they're finished as far as the refugees are concerned. UN sources say that the U.S. is planning to eliminate UNRWA altogether. In 1993 and 94, for the first time, the U.S. government under Clinton voted against the UN resolutions on Palestinian refugees. Before the U.S. used to vote for them, but of course didn't mean it. Now it's at least honest. It's just straight voting against them. Again, alone in the world on this. Well, let me turn next. There's more to say about what's going on, but let me turn to the reaction, which has been kind of interesting. Here's a sort of a sample from the world press. I'll just start with some headlines. Israel agrees to quit West Bank. That's the Guardian in London, starting from the far left. Okay, Israel agrees to quit West Bank. Big headline, front page story. Israel and PLO sign agreement extending Palestinian rule to most of West Bank. That's a Reuters chronology, reprinted in the Boston Globe and the Financial Times, biggest business press in London, and all over the place. Rabin negotiated the accord to eventually cede Israeli control of the West Bank to the Palestinians. That's the New York Times. Rabin proposed walling off the West Bank and Gaza from Israel. That's the Washington Post. Rabin's thinking underwent a remarkable transformation. From 1992. It was astonishing because he agreed to peace with the Palestinians. That's the big think piece in the New York Times after his assassination. The plans inevitably lead to an authentic Palestinian state, not a Bantustan, as some critics claim. That's the London New Statesman, now we're really out on the left, in an article denouncing Edward Said for having pointed out correctly that it's leading to a Bantustan, as the Israeli press points out. It's a historic compromise, a painful peace, Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and so on. It was a day of awe. September 28th, the day in which Israel agreed to quit the West Bank, was a day of awe, big Boston Globe headline said. Well, that's a pretty fair sample. In fact, a very fair sample. You have to look hard to find any deviation from that. I haven't found any, in fact. Has some interesting features, the press coverage. One interesting feature has to do with factual claims, which are not just false, as one expects, but utterly absurd. They're not even close to true. So did Israel agree to quit the West Bank? Well, have a look at the figures. Did Israel and the PLO sign an agreement extending Palestinian rule to most of the West Bank? Take a look. Did Rabin negotiate an accord to eventually cede Israeli control of the West Bank to the Palestinians, as the New York Times says? Not a hint. Certainly nothing in the accords or any other accords. And in fact, he said the opposite very explicitly. I read you his account of what the ultimate solution will be, the permanent long-term one. Did his thinking undergo a remarkable transformation from 1992? Yeah, it's true, actually. In 1992, he was still calling for about 40% of the West Bank. This time, he settled for about twice that much. So that's a kind of remarkable transformation, maybe, but not exactly what was intended. Does the plan inevitably lead to a real Palestinian state, not a Bantustan, as the New Statesman claims out on the left? Well, lefties can believe what they want on the basis of doctrinal fanaticism, but if you turn to the facts, there's certainly nothing of the kind. The Israeli commentators are quite accurate, and just to make clear, Shimon Peres, right after, who's now foreign minister, and remember that's the dove, right after the signing of the agreement, he had a meeting of ambassadors in which he explained it to them, and he said, what you're thinking about a Palestinian state, he said, that will never happen. You can be certain of that. So whatever the New Statesman may prefer to believe, Shimon Peres, the negotiator, the dovish negotiator, like Rabin, has a different idea. Shortly after, Peres had a meeting with Newsweek editors. Here I'm quoting from the Israeli journalists who accompanied him. He was asked by the Newsweek editors, would this lead to a Palestinian state? And the answer was a resounding no. And he then started, I'm quoting, on a learned explanation of why, but he wasn't able to finish because right then the O.J. Simpson verdict was announced, so everybody raced off to the television set to watch that. And afterwards, the Newsweek editors were so excited by the O.J. Simpson verdict that they couldn't go back to this kind of minor question about, why there would never be a Palestinian state, so we really don't know the rest of what he intended to say. Of all of these headlines, there's one that's accurate, namely the Boston Globe one. We should be cheer our local talent. The headline that referred to a day of awe is quite correct. The true dimensions of it was a very impressive achievement what the U.S. carried off. And its true dimensions only become clear if you look a little bit at the background. I don't know, how long have I been talking? Fair, came close to a confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. We damn near had war, as Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, put it, and nobody wanted to fool around anymore. It was too dangerous. So a diplomatic process was set in motion. And its major step was UN 242, Security Council Resolution 242 in November 1967, which rejected the right of acquisition of territory by force and went on to call for full peace in return for full Israeli withdrawal. Those were the terms. Full peace in return for full withdrawal. Now, full withdrawal had a qualification. There could be minor border adjustments, minor and mutual border adjustments. Now, that, remember, there's been a lot of lying about this, so it's worth remembering that that was U.S. policy, official U.S. policy. Arthur Goldberg, the U.S. mediator, sort of sold the thing to the Arab states by insisting on this. Full withdrawal, minor and mutual adjustments if necessary. And that remained, Israel wouldn't accept the full withdrawal, and in '67 the Arab states wouldn't accept full peace. So of course everybody signed it, but people, that's diplomacy. But nobody meant it, at that point. Well, that remained official U.S. policy. It was, in fact, made even more official and open by the official U.S. government plan announced by the Secretary of State Rogers, the Rogers Plan in 1969, endorsed by President Nixon, and so on. There's just no question about this. I mean, don't have all the documents, but enough to know that this was the position. So it went until February 1971. And then things changed, crucially. In February 1971, Egypt became the first Arab state to accept completely the U.S. position. President Sadat of Egypt, in negotiations there was a mediator, UN mediator, Gunnar Jarring, who made a proposal, which is approximately this, and Egypt agreed. Incidentally, it didn't deal with the West Bank, just with the Sinai. So it was like part of it. But he said, in return for Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai, forget the West Bank, Egypt would accept full peace, all arrangements, wording of UN 242 and so on. Israel recognized it as a genuine peace offer. Those are their words, rejected it, saying they would not withdraw to the '67 borders. In Yitzhak Rabin's memoirs, he describes this as a famous milestone on the road to peace. Well, that's Yitzhak Rabin's memoirs. In U.S. history, it is gone. Try to find it. Even scholarship, as I say, lies about it. Just flatly lies about it or suppresses it. Not entirely, but for the most part. The reason is pretty straightforward. At that time, the U.S. had to make a decision. Was it going to keep to its own policy, the policy it had crafted, or was it going to shift and join its Israeli client at that point in rejecting U.S. policy? And there was a struggle internally, and it was won by our visionary, Henry Kissinger, who insisted on what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. And everybody thought at that time that force was in the hands of Israel and the U.S., so it wasn't an issue. So no negotiations, stalemate. U.S. rejected its own policy. And since by definition the U.S. is pursuing the peace process, that is a definition, incidentally. The peace process is by definition whatever the United States is doing. So therefore this had to be erased from history. And in fact, it has been erased from history, but it's there. You can find it if you look. Well, since that time, the U.S. has been alone in the world, aside from Israel, virtually alone, in rejecting withdrawal. So half of UN 242 was thrown out the window, the withdrawal half. And that's instituted in Oslo, too. That's part of the U.S. victory. No withdrawal, except as the U.S. decides. That's the main respect in which UN 242 has been eliminated. UN 242 was completely rejectionist, said nothing about the Palestinians. They're referred to as refugees. Sadat's offer said nothing about the Palestinians. They didn't exist. But the world world attitudes on this changed through the 70s. And by the mid-70s, there was a recognition of Palestinian national rights, the rights of the indigenous population. And that reached the UN Security Council in January 1976 in a resolution put forth by the three confrontation states, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, and backed by, actually by the whole world. Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the non-aligned countries, most of the, I think all, or most of the Arab world, the PLO openly, everyone, in fact, except Israel, which rejected it, and the United States, which vetoed it. This was a resolution calling for a settlement along the line, exactly like UN 242, all its wording and everything, except that in the areas that Israel would leave, there would be a Palestinian state. That was the one change from 242. So that was a recognition of Palestinian rights, which the U.S. has opposed. So the U.S. vetoed the resolution. So that's out of history, too. Again, try to find it, even in scholarly literature. And that continued. I won't go on with the rest of the story, but that continued. From then right through till 1990, the United States simply blocked every effort to carry through a diplomatic settlement, whether it was coming from Europe or the non-aligned countries or the Arabs or the PLO or anyone. From the early 80s, it was getting tricky because the PLO was insistently calling for negotiations leading to mutual recognition. And that had to be suppressed in the United States. The New York Times totally suppressed it. In fact, refused even to have a reference to it. It refused even to print letters referring to it, as the foreign editor once actually wrote a Palestinian professor in the Midwest, said, "We will not allow letters referring to this." Other newspapers like, San Francisco Herald Tribune and so on, whatever it's called, Herald Examiner, sometimes, had stories about it. But it was getting a little hard to suppress, but still the U.S. continued to do so right through the 80s until it got totally impossible at that point. In December 1988, the United States was literally becoming an international laughingstock, literally, because of its flat refusal to recognize, its insistence that Arafat say that word, as Schultz put it, which he'd been saying insistently over and over again. It was becoming kind of a joke. So the U.S. agreed to try to shut them up and put this danger of negotiations aside. The U.S. agreed to what he called a dialogue. The purpose of the dialogue was explained by the visionary Yitzhak Rabin to a delegation of Peace Now leaders who were a little worried about the dialogue. In February 1989, he said, "Don't worry about it, doesn't mean a thing." He said, "The purpose of the dialogue is to give us a year or more to suppress the intifada, the uprising that was then going on, to suppress it by violence and harsh measures, and then the whole business will be over." And everybody was happy with that. And that's indeed what happened. And is still happening. 2 days ago, Israeli tanks apparently seriously wounded 3 Norwegian UN soldiers in the security zone with anti-personnel weapons. That did get a couple of lines, but we don't know anything more about it. These are peacekeeping forces. These are UN peacekeeping forces, but they're from Norway. They're not U.S. soldiers. U.S. soldiers don't go to take part in peacekeeping operations, which is a wise thing, because the get shot at and wounded, or others who face threats. That's only other countries. In our case, the White House announced we're going to have robust rules of engagement. National Security Council, not like these wishy-washy Europeans. It's going to be like the National Security Advisor announced that if anyone fools around with our forces, we're going to hit them and hit them hard. And then more some, the president added, with deadly force. Now, there's an implication there from what wasn't said. The implication is you guys can commit as many atrocities as you like, but don't fool around with our forces, because if you do, you'll really get smashed. That's our military doctrine, and that's why the United States never takes part in peacekeeping operations where civilians are involved. Sometimes it's willing to move in when it looks sort of easy, like in Somalia. It looked as though the famine was sort of more or less over and the fighting had died down, so it looked like you could kind of move in and get some good photo ops. But it turned out that, some teenagers struck their fists and that sort of thing. And the thing ended up with, according to Washington sources, somewhere between 7,500 and 10,000 Somalis murdered. couple of dozen American soldiers, and that's why the U.S. does not take part in peacekeeping forces. And until we can civilize our own society to some extent, that's a wise decision. Anyway, the Norwegian troops were. The fact that they were attacked by Israeli tanks did get a couple of lines, so we have to be honest about that. Well, that's, so the terror, and that goes on. I mean, there's no comment about Israeli terrorism in Lebanon. It goes on as they feel like. And that's sort of right in a way. They inherit the right of terrorism from the master, who has universal right of terrorism. And if you're a client, you just kind of get it by inheritance. So there's no point in saying anything about that. Well, what about these Palestinian forces that are being brought in to run the remaining areas under the standard colonial pattern? They're extremely brutal, very brutal. There's been extensive discussion about this in the Israeli press. And Palestinian human rights activists and lawyers and others have tried to say something about it and take quite a beating. That shouldn't really come as any particular surprise. First of all, there's a historical precedent. I mean, that is the historical precedent. So it's not surprising that it's being applied here, too, under this new colonial regime. And also, it was announced in advance. Right immediately after the Oslo I agreement, Prime Minister Rabin explained to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that the Palestinian forces who were being brought in, mostly from the outside, incidentally, on the classic pattern, the Palestinian forces who were being brought in to deal with the Arabs, he said, will be able to do it, I'm now quoting him, without problems caused by appeals to the High Court of Justice, without problems caused by the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, without problems from all sorts of bleeding hearts and mothers and fathers. They'll be able to just handle it right. Henry Kissinger recently described Yitzhak Rabin as a visionary. He said, when you sit where I do and where I have, the number of world-class thinkers among statesmen is very limited, and he was one of them. The visionary Kissinger may not understand very much, but he recognizes a fellow visionary when he sees one, and he was doubtless impressed by that kind of comment, of which there are many, incidentally. The visionary Rabin had also outlined the permanent settlement, the outlines of the permanent settlement. Remember, this is just a stage. In the permanent settlement, he told the Israeli parliament, Israel will maintain control of united Jerusalem, which will extend, he said. It will go as far as Ma'ale Adumim to the east and Givat Ze'ev in the north. Those are outside suburbs. Ma'ale Adumim is quite far to the east. Its borders reach about 8 miles from Jericho, and it goes almost to the Jordan Valley, which Israel will also keep. And in addition, it will keep, he said, blocks of settlements, designated blocks of settlements in Judea and Samaria, as in Gaza, referring to what's called the Gush Katif block. The fact that these are blocks of settlements are important. That was one of the big things that were fought about in the Cairo agreements. The Palestinian Authority was initially willing to grant the Israeli settlements all sorts of rights, but Israel insisted on blocks. That means big regions surrounding the settlements, and those will be whatever they'll be. But those blocks, according to Rabin, will remain along with Jordan Valley, Jerusalem extending virtually to the Jordan Valley. Notice that bisects any potential Palestinian area. There are other breaks, if you look, that cut it up further into what are called cantons in the Israeli press, very much as in Gaza. Well, that's the final settlement that's looked forward to, which is essentially the what is I doubt that Israel will keep all the territory it now has. That would be completely crazy, in fact. Probably they'll go back to something like the most extreme demands that have been put forth in the past. The current agreement is, in fact, way out at the extreme. In fact, what it looks like now is the Sharon Plan of 1981. Ariel Sharon, the extreme right wing of Israeli politics, put forth a plan in 1981. It was a little different than the Labor Party plans. Not all that different, but somewhat different. And this one kind of looks like that. as has been pointed out in the Israeli press, I should say. And Ariel Sharon himself is reported by the American press to be pretty pleased with the whole business. Also, not surprisingly, because it's the most extreme proposal that's ever been made. Also pretty pleased is Yisrael Harel, who was the founder of the Yeshat Council. That's the Council of Settlers and Jewish settlers in Judea and Samaria, and the editor of its ultra-right journal, Nakuda. He said, yeah, we can live with this, it's fine. Yossi Beilin, who's the right-hand man of Shimon Peres and considered a really far-out dove, he informed the Israeli, he wrote the press, that all settlements remain intact. He said that the negotiations were delayed for some months so that we could carry, because of the immense financial investment involved in ensuring that the blocks around the settlements would remain completely intact and building them. And then he added that the situation for the settlements was never better, the settlements in the West Bank, and that's pretty well accurate. In Israel, it's been pointed out in the press, in the mainstream press, that the arrangement that's now being made is rather like it's not like the end of apartheid in South Africa, it's like the institution of apartheid. It's like the moment when the apartheid system was instituted with Bantustans and pass rules and all that kind of business, and that's pretty much what's happening now. That's an accurate description. Turning to the facts on the ground, which sort of work this out as implement it. There's been a considerable expansion of settlements in the occupied territory since the Oslo I agreement was signed, and that's continuing. There's been an increase of 40% in building starts since 1993, though incidentally it hasn't yet reached the peak periods of before. Also being built are a very elaborate network of bypass roads. In fact, the military budget was just announced a couple of days ago, and the military budget goes up largely because of the construction of this tremendous array of bypass roads, which are big highways designed to make sure that those 100 or so sectors of local Palestinian autonomy will be invisible and separated from one another, which means you already can, but when this is finished, it'll be even easier to drive around the West Bank from Israel to Jordan and through the West Bank and so on without ever seeing any Arabs, except maybe you could see some huts up on the hill, behind a dirt road that doesn't go anywhere or something like that. That's continuing at a very substantial rate. The new budget, just announced a couple of days ago, which was supported by the right wing, incidentally, was supported unconditionally by Likud, the right wing part of the government, has about over $30 million for new settlements, starting new settlement activity in the territories, and it spelled out. So it incorporates Gush Katif, southern part of the Gaza Strip, into the Negev, into the Israeli Negev, in the Agriculture Department budget, and it gives special inducements to settlers in the southern part of Gaza for building things like fish tanks. This is an arid desert area, incidentally, where most of the water is used by a couple of thousand Jewish settlers. So if you go there and you build things like fish tanks, you get more. There are also continuing inducements to settlers to go to the West Bank. They have a considerably higher standard of life than the ones who remain in Israel because they get special subsidies to try to get them to go there, and those are going to continue, including new inducements to go to Ma'ale Adumim, this big region to the east of Jerusalem, to be ultimately unified into it, where there have recently been Bedouin lands expropriated for new Jewish settlement, and there's a new bypass road that was just opened on October 23rd. The new plans are to add 6,000 dwelling units there and 24 hotel rooms. They're aiming at a population of 50,000 there, which will ultimately be assimilated into Greater Jerusalem, and as I said, more or less bisects the West Bank. That's one of the many several cantons. Gaza is treated the same way. It's been sliced into kind of enclaves. the roads, there are roads that cut it all over the place. One of the roads is at the most strategic area. It separates Gaza City, which indeed is handed over to the Palestinians, because Israel just wanted to get out of there. It hands over Gaza City. It separates Gaza City from the big refugee camps, and the rest of the network of roads cuts the strip up in all sorts of other ways. It's also, the Palestinian areas are separated from Egypt as well, and that means that the population can freely be imprisoned, either all or in part, selectively, at any time that anyone wants, that Israel wants, and the same is true now in the West Bank. The imprisonment is done by simply road control, or which is closures, or even worse, by curfews. These are done for various reasons, sometimes for punishment, but more often for deterrence. So after there's a big Israeli atrocity, you have to punish the Palestinians, and that happens routinely. So, for example, after the massacre at the at the mosque in Hebron, the Palestinian population was put under long and heavy curfew to deter them from any reaction. And sometimes it's done for, that's common, sometimes it's done for other reasons, like around the time of the signing of Oslo II, for several weeks the population was just imprisoned, to make sure that nothing went wrong. And sometimes it's done for other reasons. So, for example, to just to liberate Jewish citizens from the annoying presence of the locals. Example was a couple of months ago during the Passover holidays in 1995. I'll just quote from the Hebrew press on this. The Arab population of Hebron was locked up under 24-hour curfew for 4 days. Reason, quoting now, so that settlers, that's the 450 Jewish settlers who live there, so that settlers and 35,000 Jewish visitors brought there in chartered buses could have picnics and travel around the city freely, dancing in the streets with public prayers to bring down the government of the left, laying the cornerstone for a new residential building, and indulging in other pleasures. This is under the protective gaze of extra military forces that were brought in. They used the opportunity, I'm continuing to quote, used the opportunity to insult the Palestinians imprisoned in their houses and to throw stones at them if they dared to peek out of the windows at the Jews celebrating in their city. And then they brought the celebration to the close, still quoting, by settlers rampaging through the old city, destroying property and smashing car windows in a city magically cleansed of Palestinians. Children, parents, and old people are effectively jailed for days in their homes, which in most cases are seriously overcrowded, though they are able to turn on a TV set to watch a female settler saying happily, "There's a curfew, thank God," and to hear the merry dances of settlers and festive processions, some of them to the Patriarch's Cave, which is open only to Jews. Meanwhile, still quoting, commerce, careers, studies, the family, love, all are immediately disrupted. The medical system was paralyzed, and many sick persons in Hebron were unable to reach hospitals during the curfew, and women giving birth could not arrive in time at the clinics. Well, that's the description from the press. Very bitterly critical, incidentally, but not here. Here you just praise it as a great step in democracy and pay for it. That the opportunities for that now extend with the increase, with the new arrangements that are put in place under the historic compromise. In East Jerusalem, Israel can now continue to carry out the programs that the U.S. pays for and approves of. Might as well tell you what those are. These have been going on for some years. These are programs to reduce Arab citizens to second-class status in formerly Arab East Jerusalem, the part conquered in '67. These were devised and implemented by Teddy Kollek, former mayor, who's very much revered here as a great Democrat and, humanitarian and so on. They're now extended under Ehud Olmert, the new mayor from the right. The purpose was explained by Kollek's advisor on Arab affairs. He said the purpose is to place difficulties in the way of planning in the Arab sector. Kollek himself, as he put it, "I don't want to give the Arabs a feeling of equality, though he said it would be worthwhile doing so here and there where it doesn't cost us so much. Otherwise we will suffer." His planning commission, in fact, advised development for Arabs under certain conditions, namely if it would have a picture window effect, which will be seen by a large number of people, residents and tourists and so on. Khalek himself, while he was being praised here, informed the Israeli media that for the Arabs, he said, "I have nurtured nothing and built nothing apart from a sewage system, which," he quickly added, "was not intended for their good, for their welfare," they being the Arabs of East Jerusalem. Rather, there were some cases of cholera in Arab sectors, and the Jews were afraid that they would catch it, so we installed sewage and a water system against cholera. Those are the good old days. Under Olmert, the new mayor, it's apparently getting considerably harsher, according to reports from there. These Khalek programs were analyzed by an Israeli city planner, Sarah Kaminker. She was a city council member and a city planner in Khalek's administration. This is in a recent report that was submitted to the High Court, sort of like the Supreme Court, on behalf of Arab plaintiffs by the Catholic Legal Resource Center for Human Rights in Jerusalem. Her report says, in Jewish West Jerusalem's Jewish, that's been part of Israel. In Jewish West Jerusalem, she said, the report concluded, there is a detailed report, there's large-scale illegal construction, which the municipality does not prevent and retroactively approves. In Arab East Jerusalem, standards are different. There, 86% of the land has been made unavailable for use by Arabs. The remaining 14% is not vacant land, but land that has already been developed. Vacant lands are reserved for development by Jews or kept as what are called open landscape views, which are often for eventual development for Jews, so it regularly turns out. The dearth of land zoned for Arab housing is a result of government planning and development policy in East Jerusalem, where the Khalek administration conducted a consistent effort since 1974 to limit the land area available to Arabs for licensed construction. The goal is what's called demographic balance, partially achieved in 1993 when Khalek's municipality was able to announce that the number of Jews residing in East Jerusalem, that's formerly Arab East Jerusalem, had surpassed the number of Arabs. Well, the report goes on to say that the government has provided housing in formerly Arab East Jerusalem, 60,000 units for Jews, 555 for Arabs. Arabs whose homes have been demolished for Jewish settlement often come from the lowest economic strata of the community and now live in makeshift hovels, doubled and tripled up with other families or in tents and caves. Now, some are willing to build their own homes and may have resources, but they're barred by law and subject to demolition if they proceed, and that threat is executed, unlike Jewish West Jerusalem, where the report goes on, the problem of illegal construction is as serious, if not more so, than in East Jerusalem, but the laws aren't applied. There are other ways to bring about demographic balance. For example, there are discriminatory regulations on building heights, which are very low for Arab settlements, but you can build high buildings for Jewish settlement, and all sorts of other zoning provisions and other legal instruments to intensify the discrimination between Jews and Arabs, and certainly that's true in Israel too, always using funds provided by the U.S. taxpayer, and either directly or sometimes through tax-free donations. It's the only country where you can give tax-free charitable donations to implement proposals of that kind. And it's always with the extensive approval of admiring U.S. commentators from across the spectrum, left to right. Well, that's now East Jerusalem. It can be extended there since the jihad is officially over and gotten the official stamp of legitimacy, and now on the West Bank too, under Oslo too. During the occupation, the 67, before the peace process was implemented, and it was under military occupation, the military authorities had issued a regulation which reads as follows: no permits will be given for expanding agriculture or industry which may compete with the State of Israel. That was the fundamental rule for the occupied territories. They were allowed what in U.S. traditional parlance is called complementary development. They're treated the way the U.S. treated, say, Latin America, which was allowed to have complementary development, but not development that might compete with U.S. interests. So when the U.S. took over Brazil in 1945. Brazil was allowed to have, say, a steel industry, but only if they produced low-grade steel, which the U.S. wasn't interested in producing, not if they got involved in the kind of steel production that we wanted. And that's standard. In fact, the British Empire ran that way, and the French Empire, and indeed everyone. So again, it's not surprising that Israel would have imposed those regulations to prevent any development in India is the same. In the occupied territories, for example, blocking a nail-making factory in Hebron because somebody thought it might interfere with a competing Jewish one. Although the health system was in fact extended, the reason was explained by René Jacquet in a recent article in a leading journal, because they feared that disease might endanger the residents of Tel Aviv if they didn't have a health system there. But development, no, that was not permitted, on a kind of a classic pattern of pretty maybe strong, but normal, perfectly normal. That's in fact a large part of the reason why the third world and the first world differ the way they do today. Part of the reason, a very substantial part. They didn't differ that way a couple hundred years ago. Well, that left the population in the territories a couple of options. One was exile, the preferred option, and the other was kind of what the Israeli press has regularly described as semi-slave labor under miserable conditions within Israel. That was the other option, or starvation. That second option, the semi-slave labor, that's recently been reduced. Israel's been bringing in real slave-type labor from traditional beneficiaries of Western civilization like Philippines and Thailand and so on, and also from Romania. Another U.S. favorite, it was the favorite U.S. state in Eastern Europe under Nicolae Ceausescu, who was particularly beloved by the Reaganites and Thatcher and admired by them. And now they're coming in too, so that's even more easily exploitable labor, because their families aren't even close, nothing's even close by, and they're completely isolated. This is vividly described and bitterly described in the Israeli press, but you don't want it to be known here because we have to praise the recipients of our massive donations, of course.